Greetings, class, and welcome back to our discussion of early America. We're going to cover a pretty big chunk of American history today. Hopefully, we'll do it fairly quickly. But I want you guys to remember in this section, we're looking at this bigger picture. How did we get from this united country with this working government in 1800 to a country that's so divided by 1860 that we end up having a civil war? Every slide that we discuss is not going to be the answer to that, but the answer lies in the bigger picture. So again, pay attention to those little things that you see that are leading to division, specifically between the northern states and the southern states. We've already talked about that the North is embracing industry, and the South is continuing the tradition of agrarianism that's always existed in the world. We've also talked about how the North is sort of pushing away from slavery. The North has pretty much outlawed slavery. And we know that industry and slavery don't go together, while at the same time in the South, slavery is part of the economy, especially that agrarian cotton growing economy. But slavery is also something that's pretty much always existed in the world, regardless of where you go and when you go, whether you went to ancient Asia or ancient Africa or ancient Europe, ancient Mexico. It doesn't matter. Anywhere in the world, all of these agrarian civilizations had slavery at some point in time for most of their history. And so today, when we look back at this time period in American history, we look at the southern states as sort of the outlier. But you do have to remember that during the early 1800s, the South was continuing something that it always had been. The North is really the sort of, new thing, the outlier, at least for that time period. We do know that Britain has become anti-slavery, as they're the first industrialized nations, and other European nations that have industrialized have turned away from slavery as well. We also talked about the War of 1812. Our last video was pretty much focused on the War of 1812, which took place during the Madison administration. So we are going to finish with the Madison administration today. We'll also talk about the Monroe administration and the second Adams administration, not John Adams, but his son, John Quincy Adams. All right, so picking up where we left off with the War of 1812, we do need to mention the Second Barbary War. All right, now we talked about the First Barbary War during Jefferson. This is really just a very brief resurgence of conflict in that area. If you remember, we're talking about the Mediterranean Sea and North Africa. We talked about how these Barbary coast states that are part of the Ottoman Empire were basically using pirates to attack European ships. And if the European ships, thereby American ships, if they would pay tribute to these Barbary states, then they wouldn't be attacked by pirates. We also said that a lot of times when these ships were attacked, that these sailors were then sold into slavery in the Ottoman Empire. And we had the First Barbary War, and that resulted with basically these Barbary states would make sure that the Barbary pirates wouldn't attack American ships anymore. We would not pay the tribute, but we did pay a ransom for sailors that they had already taken prisoner. Basically, after the War of 1812, some of this stuff has started up again. It really started before the end of the War of 1812, but the War of 1812 was sort of the most important thing going on in both America and in Europe. So not that Europe cared about the War of 1812, but they had the Napoleonic Wars. So the Napoleonic Wars have ended. The War of 1812 has ended. Trade has pretty much resumed. And now the attention is to these pirate attacks that are happening. And so once again, America, this time under James Madison, will send naval forces to deal with that. And it's very short-lived, and it is an American victory. But this American victory in the Mediterranean gets followed by a British and Dutch bombardment of Algiers. Algiers is one of these North African countries, and this is pretty much going to put an end to piracy in that region. Neither the U.S. nor the European nations would continue to pay tribute to these states, and pretty much confirmed that there would be trade without fear of piracy in that region. Another thing that's important, and this is something that we are going to keep talking about. This is something that will have importance pretty much for the rest of the section, is something called the American system. The American system was, parts of this were devised earlier, but it really gets put in place and called the American system by a senator from Kentucky named Henry Clay. Basically, this was a plan to unify the United States and strengthen our economy. It looked to expand trade by exporting things like cotton, tobacco, sod, and tar. Now, these things obviously are agrarian, so this would benefit the southern states, especially the cotton. It also called for high tariffs. A tariff is a tax on an import. And so what's interesting is the reasoning for the tariff. All right, a tax is a way the government gets money. And in previous tariffs, that's what they were for, to get money. This one's a little different. This is actually proposing a tariff, a tax on an import, to protect U.S. manufacturing. In other words, if the prices of overseas goods are raised through taxation, then people would be more likely to buy American-made goods. And so that would protect U.S. industry. That is a very important thing to understand going forward, all right? Because a tariff is a federal tax that impacts everyone, but it only benefits the northern states because that's where the industry is. And so we need to keep that in mind. Sorry. The American system also supports the Bank of the United States. Remember, we had the first Bank of the United States under Hamilton. It was a 20-year charter. Around this time, it would be time to renew another 20-year charter for a national bank. And so the American system said that the national bank was good because it promoted economic stability. And then it also promoted federal funding for infrastructure, building things like roads and canals. This is really to strengthen the economy of the United States because we are expanding. And so we have, these western states, we have eastern states, we have agrarian states in the south, we have industrialized states in the north. And so we need to connect all those things, connect the raw materials of the west to the agricultural products of the south and the industry of the north. And so building roads and canals and things like that would help make that happen. So the tariff of 1816, this goes back to the American system. The tariff of 1816 is the first tariff passed for the purpose of protecting U.S. manufactured goods. It is not just there for the sake of raising revenue, but actually to protect American manufacturing. Obviously, that benefits the North, but this is interesting because they actually got the South to support it. For one, there's a lot of political unity during this time, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But also, the North is making stuff out of Southern grown cotton. So, the idea is that this is going to help both regions. And this tariff's only supposed to last 3 years, and so we'll see what happens with that as well. They also renew the charter of the Bank of the United States, or create the second Bank of the United States. So another 20-year charter. So this is established in 1816. So this charter will run to 1836. One thing to note about the second Bank of the United States, or the second national bank, these national banks, they are private corporations. Okay, they're not part of the U.S. government the way something like the Senate or the House of Representatives or the Supreme Court or anything like that is. This is a private business. All right, for the purpose of doing business with the United States. The United States will borrow money from the bank, pay money back to the bank, etc. All right. About 80% of the Second National Bank is privately owned, and about a pretty good percentage of those private investors are actually Europeans. So it's called the second bank of the United States because it does business with the United States, but there are a lot of people in Europe specifically that have financial interests in this bank. That's going to be important later, so don't forget that. All right, not this video, but another video, we're gonna talk about that. Okay. All right, so after Madison, we get James Monroe as the president. Monroe was the Secretary of State under Madison. He is also a Democratic Republican, so if you're keeping score, that is, Jefferson, Madison, and now Monroe are Democratic Republicans. They are also all from Virginia, which is going to be important. We'll talk about that in a second. Monroe would be elected to 2 terms, so he's going to be elected in 1816 and re-elected in 1820. The period where Monroe is president is referred to as the era of good feelings. Part of the reason that we call it that is because, we had pretty good feelings coming off the War of 1812. Remember, the War of 1812 technically ended in a draw. It was status quo antebellum. It was like the war never happened, but Americans felt like they had won. They had pretty much accomplished all of their goals, except, they didn't get Canada, but everything else they had achieved, and so Americans felt pretty good about it. But also, the War of 1812 was the end of the Federalist Party. If you remember, in the last video, we talked about the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention was the Federalist up in New England. They were critical of several aspects of the Constitution, and there was even a suggestion that maybe they should secede from the Union, that New England should secede from the Union. That happened the same time that Jackson and Pakenham were preparing for the Battle of New Orleans. And of course, that was a one-sided victory. Jackson won that battle. It was a decisive American victory. Unfortunately for us, it didn't technically count because the war was already over. But people are so excited about that victory, about Jackson's victory at New Orleans, that when it's realized that the Federalists were talking all these things about changing the Constitution and being pro-secession, and of course the Federalist Party was pro-British, it really made the Federalist Party look un-American. And so the Federalist Party is now destroyed. It's collapsed. You can't win an election as a Federalist. And so with Monroe, there is no party division. Everybody's a Democratic Republican. Everybody's in the same party, which really means you have no parties. In fact, there's so much political unity that Monroe is almost unanimously elected. If you remember, we said that George Washington was unanimously elected twice by the Electoral College. Monroe comes pretty close. It is by design that he is not unanimously elected. Basically, one of the electors decided not to vote for Monroe. Not that he didn't like Monroe. He knew Monroe was going to win, and so he decided to defer his vote just so Monroe did not win unanimously, and therefore that wouldn't be taken away from George Washington. So there's a lot of political unity in this era of good feelings. Monroe is also the last of the founding fathers to be president. We had this era where, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, these were all founding fathers. They played a role in the American Revolution. And he's the last of those guys. In fact, by the time Monroe becomes president in 1817, fashions have changed. When we think about the way men dressed during the colonial period, guys like Washington and Adams and Jefferson. You have images in your head of how those guys dressed. By the time we get to Monroe, men don't dress like that anymore. They don't wear the knee length, breeches anymore. They don't wear the long, coats. They don't wear three-cornered hats or any, by this point, men are dressing more how we think of 19th century dress, long pants, top hats. However, Monroe still wears that older Revolutionary era, late 18th century clothing. It's not because he's out of fashion or anything like that. He's using that imagery. It's advertisement that he was one of the founding fathers, and so. But he's the last of the founding father presidents. He's also the end of the Virginia dynasty. All right, what's the Virginia dynasty? Well, out of our first 5 presidents, 4 of them were from Virginia. All right, so he'll be the last of those. All right, for the majority of this video, we'll be talking about the Monroe presidency. So one of the first things we want to talk about regarding the Monroe administration is diplomacy with Great Britain. So part of this era of good feelings was, reestablishing some type of diplomacy with Great Britain after our second war with Britain. But we also want to fix a lot of these problems we had out west. And so we're going to redefine the border a little bit. There's basically 2 treaties that we make with Britain to sort of fix these problems we're having between the United States and Canada. And so one of those is the Rush-Bagot Treaty. This basically is going to demilitarize the Great Lakes. Basically, the United States and Canada share the Great Lakes, and so this is going to make that happen. And then there's the Treaty of 1818. There's actually a very long name for this treaty. We're just going to call it the Treaty of 1818. But what this does is it's going to take, basically draw a straight line across the 49th parallel, all right? From the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains. This will be the border between Canada and the United States. So this causes the U.S. to lose a little bit of land, and it causes Britain to lose a little bit of land, and then you gain a little bit in return. And so we now have a clearly defined boundary until you get to the Rocky Mountains. Now everything on the other side of the Rockies, north of California belongs to Spain, but everything north of California across the Rockies, we call the Oregon country or the Oregon territory. This is actually going to be shared between Britain and the United States. All right, so when you think of the Oregon territory, don't think of just our modern day state of Oregon. This would be like Oregon, Washington, and then parts of Canada, like British Columbia. So all of that would be the Oregon territory, and it belongs to both the United States and Great Britain. We will see later how that boundary eventually gets defined later. Okay, going to the south, all right, there is something that it could hardly be called a war, but we're going to call it a war. People refer to it as a war, the First Seminole War. And so after the War of 1812, if you remember, during the War of 1812 in the South, we had what was called the Creek War, and we had Jefferson had defeated the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, which gave the United States large parts of Alabama and Georgia to the United States, right, from the Creeks. Florida belonged to Spain. It's its own, it's not part of the United States. But after the War of 1812, all right, and what I'm about to say is a little controversial, right? There's a lot of debate about this, but for the most part, the consensus is that there was no group of Indians historically before the War of 1812 referred to as the Seminoles. All right. Now, I'm sure there's some Seminoles out there, and there's some historians who would say, well, you know, the Seminoles could actually trace their roots back to blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine. All right. But when you study the colonial period and you study the Spanish records and the English records and the French records, they're never talking about there's no Indians that they're referring to as the Seminoles. The consensus is that the Seminoles were created out of the refugees and the mass, displacement and relocation of Indians during the War of 1812. The War of 1812 in the South was an Indian war. And so you had a lot of Indians displaced by war, forced to relocate by war. And the idea is that these Indians, these refugees of Red Sticks and other Indians, we had Tecumseh's Confederacy and things like that, that a lot of these refugees from these Indian tribes came together to form the Seminoles, okay? And they were basically in northwest Florida, and then southwest Georgia, southeast Alabama. It's sort of that pink region you see there on the map. Because this land north of Florida belonged to the United States, Monroe had ordered Andrew Jackson. Remember, Andrew Jackson's a military officer. He had ordered Jackson to go down there and to remove the Seminoles from U.S. territory. So Jackson goes down to remove these Seminoles. Now, again, we're talking Alabama and Georgia. After the War of 1812, the United States they create the state of Alabama and the state of Mississippi. So we now have Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi right there in a row, with Florida beneath them, okay, south of them. So Jackson's told to remove the Seminoles from U.S. territory, but Jackson takes it a step further and he invades Florida. And so Jackson's invasion of Florida is really what we're referring to when we call this thing the First Seminole War. There's basically two things that come out of this that we need to discuss. The first is called the Adams-Onis Treaty. Adams in this case refers to John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is the son of the second president, John Adams. He is the Secretary of State under Monroe. So Monroe's the president. John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State. He negotiates this treaty with Spain called the Adams-Onis Treaty in February of 1819. Basically, Spain ends up transferring Florida to the United States. So the Adams-Onis Treaty is how the United States gets Florida. All right, now notice it's called the Florida Territory. It is not a U.S. state yet. All right, it is just a territory, but it now belongs to the United States. The Adams-Onis Treaty also clearly defines the boundary between the United States and New Spain. So what that's referring to is everything from Texas to California, drawing that line, because of course Oregon and the Missouri Territory and all that belongs to the United States. Now, the other thing that come out of the First Seminole War is the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, and it's not that it's not as important in our story here, but it basically moves the Seminoles further south into Central Florida. So you're moving them from North Florida to Central Florida, further away from Alabama and Georgia, and of course we'll see what happens with that later. Very important Supreme Court case that happens during the Monroe administration. Now, this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Monroe himself, but it does happen during his administration, and it's a very important Supreme Court case, so we do need to mention it. So, if you remember, when we talked about Marbury versus Madison, I made the point that when you study a Supreme Court case, the facts of the case itself are not as important as the outcome of the case, because the ruling by the Supreme Court establishes a precedent that can only be changed by another Supreme Court ruling. So this is an important case because it establishes something that continues on and on and on and on. All right, so just a little bit of background about McCulloch v. Maryland. Again, this is not the important part, but basically this arose from a conflict between the states and the federal government over the national bank. Basically, Maryland thought that they could impede the function of the Second National Bank by implementing a tax on any banknotes not issued by the state of Maryland. All right, so money issued by the Second National Bank would be taxed in Maryland. And of course, this causes some drama. It ends up going to court. And Maryland argues that the Second National Bank is basically unconstitutional because there's nothing in the Constitution about a bank. The Constitution doesn't mention a national bank. And so this goes to the Supreme Court of the United States. And what the Supreme Court rules, and this is the important part, okay? Supreme Court defends the national bank. So yes, there's nothing about a bank in the Constitution, but there is a clause in the Constitution that says the U.S. government, the federal government, can do what is necessary and proper to fulfill its duties that are explicitly stated in the Constitution. All right, so basically the Supreme Court saying that banks are not in the Constitution. Okay, everybody agrees with that. However, there are things in the Constitution that are explicit responsibilities of the federal government, and therefore the federal government can do whatever is necessary and proper to fulfill those responsibilities, and therefore this bank is necessary because it allows the U.S. to fulfill the duties that are explicitly listed in the Constitution. Okay, so that's very important. We call this the necessary and proper clause. But it also says that the federal government is supreme over the states. And there was a lot of debate about that before, in early America, and there's still a little bit of debate about this today, about where does the federal government's power stop and where does the state's power start, and can the state do things that the federal government says that you can't? We still see that problem today. We see that problem today with things like the border, but we're going to see that problem throughout American history. The Civil War will definitely have a lot to do with that argument, and we will see something much closer probably in the next video that has to do with that argument. All right, so important case there. Let's continue talking about Monroe. 1819, we have what is known as the Panic of 1819. This is the first widespread financial crisis in the U.S. So really our first, big economic recession. Basically, there's a few different factors that led to this. One is the irresponsible banking practices. So banks giving out loans that weren't backed by, hard money. There was also the economy was changing a little bit because now that the Napoleonic Wars were over, Western Europe was sort of resuming its manufacturing. Remember, the only other industrialized countries in the world during this time are in Western Europe. So during the Napoleonic Wars, which took place in Western Europe, they weren't doing a lot of manufacturing. And so it really gave the U.S. economy a boost in supplying, industrialized, manufactured goods. But once Europe sort of resumes that process, it's going to slow our economy down. And so you have things like that happening. So this obviously, a lot of loans have been put out, irresponsible loaning. People can't pay back those loans because the economy has slowed down, and then banks don't have any money because they've loaned out their money, even though the people they loaned it out to can't pay it back. So banks start closing, people start losing their farms, and then there's a lot of people who argue that the answer is to create tariffs. And so this causes a lot of problems, and it leads to a criticism of the American system. So we start to get people that oppose these things, like the tariff of 1816. Obviously, the northern states want to keep that going. Remember, it's a 3-year tariff. Southern states don't, because they can buy cheaper goods from places like Britain and France. And so we start to see some division here along the lines of the economy, and that's going to be important for, obviously the rest of this section. Another thing that has pretty important implications for the rest of this section, all right, talking about dividing the United States. Here's something that divides the United States literally, all right? We just looked at something that sort of divided it economically. This is literally divisive, all right? It's called the Missouri Compromise, also known as the Compromise of 1820, okay? Now, this is authored by Henry Clay. Henry Clay, who we've already seen, he was a war hawk, so he's one of the guys who wanted the war with Britain. He's a Democratic Republican who wanted to go to war with Britain back in 1812. He's the sort of the brains behind the American system, and now he's the author of the Missouri Compromise. And we're going to see his name again and again and again. In fact, one of his nicknames is the Great Compromiser, okay? Because of some of the compromises that he writes, and this is one of the important ones, all right? So basically, this has to do with the Missouri Territory, and there's a lot of important things here, and I'm going to try to not ramble on too long about them, but there's a few things that are very important about this situation, okay? The Missouri Territory wants to become a state. Missouri wants to become a state. Now, there are people who live in Missouri that own slaves, all right? Now, there was a time when slavery was technically not allowed in Missouri, but people found ways around it. Daniel Boone, y'all remember Daniel Boone from Kentucky? Daniel Boone eventually moved to Missouri, and Daniel Boone had a few slaves. But they knew how to get around the problem of slavery legally. When Daniel Boone moved to Missouri, it was still belonged to Spain, the Spanish Louisiana. And so there were like certain rules, like you were supposed to become Catholic and things like that, but nobody ever did any of that. It was mostly overlooked by the Spanish authorities and then the French authorities, and then eventually, America has it, and we didn't have any of that anyway. So there's people in Missouri who own slaves, okay? But now Missouri wants to join the Union. It wants to become part of the United States. We know that the northern states are not advancing slavery. Slavery is not. It's pretty much dead in the north. It's alive and well in the south. But if you look at Missouri, it is right in the middle of the United States. I mean, it's right there. Is it a southern state? Is it a northern state? Who knows? People still argue that today. But the point is, Missouri wants to be a state. And so the question becomes, if Missouri is a state, will it allow slavery or will it not allow slavery? This is an interesting thing, okay? Because I want to point something out. I don't want to spend too long on this, but I want to point something out. There are already slaves in Missouri, okay? The question is whether or not Missouri as a state will be allowed to have slaves, all right? Here's why that's interesting. In the North, there are people who are 100% against slavery. They are opposed to it. They think it's morally wrong. We call them abolitionists, okay? They've been around forever. They've been around since the colonial period. There's even, not many, but there's probably some abolitionists in the South that believe slavery is morally wrong and are against it, all right? But for the most part, the South, as a society with an economic system based on the institution of slavery, the South is not against slavery. For the most part, the North is against slavery, but it's against the expansion of slavery for political economic reasons. All right, don't misunderstand me, okay? There are Northerners who are against slavery because they think it is wrong. It is morally wrong. They are called abolitionists. All right. They are not mainstream. All right. But there is a much larger faction of Northerners who are against the expansion of slavery because of economic interest, because of things we've already seen, like do we vote yes on a tariff and protect U.S. manufacturing, which the northern states would say yes, or do we not vote yes? Do we vote no on a tariff and keep prices, cheap and competitive? And the southern states would say, yeah, that's what we want. Okay. The Congress of the United States would be the one who would have the authority to make those tariffs. So there is a political motivation for either expanding slavery or limiting the expansion of slavery. The more slave states there are, the more likely the Senate would be to vote, for slave state style interests. And the more free states there are, the more the Senate would be likely to vote for free state style interests, and those interests include economic policies like tariffs, right? So what I'm trying to say is there are slaves in Missouri, in the Missouri Territory, and there have been for decades, if not longer. But there's not been much of an outcry about that except from the people who want slavery gone, period, worldwide. Abolitionists don't want slavery at all. But as far as there not being slavery in Missouri, it doesn't really matter because it's not a state. It doesn't have senators and representatives. However, now that Missouri wants to be a state, slavery comes to the front of the issue because now if it's a state, if Missouri becomes a state, it's going to have senators and it's going to have representatives, and that will affect the balance of power in Congress. And so that's why the issue of Missouri becoming a state is so contentious, because the southern states want it to be a slave state like them, and the northern states want it to be a free state like them. And so that's why we have to have this compromise. All right. And so what Henry Clay suggests is that Missouri will be a slave state. That is why it is colored orange on this map, because it's going to be a slave state just like the other slave states. However, to maintain the balance, the North will also get another state, which is Maine. Now, Maine's way across the country in New England, right? But Maine was part of Massachusetts. Massachusetts owned Maine, going all the way back to, the colonial period. And so basically the plan is to give the South Missouri, give the North Maine, and then both sides will get a new state with, senators and representatives. But this is where it gets really interesting. He says, and from now on, any state above the 3630 parallel will be a free state, and any state below the 3630 parallel will be a slave state. Okay, so what's just happened? We've made this compromise, but now we've extended the problem by literally drawing a line across the United States. We want to talk about being divisive. This is divisive, all right? You literally divided the nation between, this is slave and this is free. Now, another thing to point out, we talked in an earlier video about the Mason-Dixon line, and a lot of people think the Mason-Dixon line is something to do with slavery. Legally, it's not. The Mason-Dixon line just defined the borders between Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. However, all right, this line, the Missouri Compromise line, is a definitive boundary of slavery from this point forward. You'll notice that Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, all of those are above the line because they were established before this compromise. So this will play a big impact in moving forward. Another thing that's important to talk about during the Monroe presidency is the Monroe Doctrine. All right, this was established in 1823. It was authored by John Quincy Adams, so again, the Secretary of State. But here's what this is about. Okay, so during the 18 teens, let's go all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars. All right, from the 18 teens through the War of 1812 and into the 1820s, there were a lot of Latin American revolutions. All right, from Mexico to Bolivia and Peru and Argentina and Chile, like all of these Latin American countries that belonged to Spain, basically fought for their independence. And a lot of that had to do with Napoleon. Remember, Napoleon took over Spain and made his brother the king of Spain. And so that partly led to these revolutions. But there was also a lot of social and cultural issues in those Latin American countries between the American-born, American-born peoples of those places and then the Spanish colonizers. Anyway, these people have been fighting for their independence, all right, for over a decade. Monroe, in the Monroe Doctrine, basically recognizes the sovereignty of these nations. We recognize the Republic, the United States of Mexico, the Mexican Republic. We recognize Argentina. We recognize Chile. We recognize Bolivia. So we are extending diplomatic recognition to these Latin American countries, saying we recognize their governments, not the European government that claims to rule over them. And then we also argued that we would oppose European colonialism in the Western Hemisphere. So if Spain or France or anybody tried to come and take over Mexico or Argentina or whatever, that the U.S. would come to their aid, that we would help defend Latin American sovereignty. Now, to be honest, at the time that this was said, the U.S. probably did not have the capability of doing that. We likely could not have, defended Argentina from an invasion or anything like that. However, this Monroe Doctrine, while it's not that important in the early 1800s, in the late 1800s and into the 1900s, it becomes one of the cornerstones of American foreign policy. So, to be honest, it's not that important in this U.S. History Part 1 class. It is very important in U.S. History Part 2. So if you take that class, you need to know a little bit about why, where this comes from, the Monroe Doctrine. All right, getting towards the end of our discussion here. All right, we're going to, so we've ended with Madison. All right, well, then we've talked about Monroe. All right, now, Monroe was elected twice, and we're going into our next election. All right, the election of 1824. Of course, the Virginia dynasty is over, and the founding father, no more founding father presidents and all that. So we're sort of entering into a new era here. All right. But this is an important election, very important election, for a few reasons. All right, for one, we just came out of the era of good feelings. Era of good feelings, partly because there was no political division. Everybody was the same. Everybody was a Democratic Republican. There was no, political division between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So that was good. And then we have this election. All right. Typically, when you have parties, like you have the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, people are going to vote for one or the other. So you're likely to come out with a winner. However, if everybody is the same party, it's kind of like not having any party. And so you're not going to get a split vote between candidate A or candidate B. You could have multiple candidates that get votes. And that's what happens here. Okay, we have 4 men who are all Democratic Republicans, and they all get a significant number of votes. All right, so these men are John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State Andrew Jackson, the war hero, all right, Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and then this guy, William Crawford. William Crawford's from Georgia, right? Um, so these four men are getting a lot of votes, all right? So they have the election, and look what happens, all right? The vote gets split four ways, all right? In the South, you get a little bit of a split between Crawford and Jackson. In the West, you get a split between Jackson and Clay. And in the North, you get a split between Adams and Adams mostly takes the North, but there's a little bit of Clay in there, a little bit of Jackson. So anyway, um, the problem is, and it's not really a problem because the Constitution never wanted parties to begin with. So there was a plan that if this ever happened of how to fix it. But let's look at why this is a problem kind of from our perspective today, all right? When you have two candidates, one is going to get more than the other. So one is going to win and one's going to lose. In this case, however, there's four men getting votes, and so there is no clear winner, all right? If you look at the popular vote there, you'll see that Jackson got 43% of the popular vote, which is more than anybody else. Adams got 31, Crawford got 13, and Clay got 13, okay? Now, the popular vote does not really matter. It kind of matters when it comes to the state, but in the federal sense, in the national sense, the popular vote doesn't matter. So we've had several presidents win elections without winning the popular vote. Probably Abraham Lincoln's probably the most famous, American president that there is, and he didn't win the popular vote. But if we look at the electoral vote, we see again that Jackson is in the lead with 38, followed by Adams with 32, then Crawford with 16, and Clay with 14. All right. So the problem is none of the candidates got a majority of the votes. All right. Jackson got more electoral votes than anybody else, but he only got 38%. All right. And the Constitution doesn't say whoever gets the most electoral votes. They have to get a majority of electoral votes, okay? 38% is not a majority. And so if a man has 38% of the electoral vote, that means 62% of the electors did not vote for him, all right? You don't want a president that 62% of the electors did not vote for. So none of these men are eligible to take office, which the Constitution understood could be a thing that happened, and so there's actually a plan for this, all right? It's called a contingent election. Kind of like we had in 1800, we're going to have an election in the House of Representatives. So the House of Representatives, every representative is going to place one vote and see what happens, all right? Now the assumption here is that Jackson's going to win because he had the most votes in the popular vote and the most votes in the electoral vote. But he doesn't. Adams wins the election. The House of Representatives elects Adams. What really causes a stew here is that Adams, before they have the election in the House of Representatives, Henry Clay drops out. He drops out of the race and endorses Adams. In return, once Adams is elected, he makes Henry Clay the Secretary of State. Now, Adams was the Secretary of State. Monroe was the Secretary of State. Madison was the Secretary of State. And Jefferson was the Secretary of State. So there has been to this point a precedent that the Secretary of State becomes the next president. And so Jackson says this doesn't seem right. It seems kind of shady. And he says that Adams and Clay made a corrupt bargain. He basically says they conspired to steal the presidency, and he's upset. All right. But Adams is the president. So notice it says Adams here is a Democratic Republican. All right. He was when he was elected because it was the era of good feelings. It was the end of the era of good feelings. But he was a Democratic Republican. Early in his life, he had been a Federalist because that's what his father was. But obviously that party doesn't exist anymore. And he will not continue to be a Democratic Republican. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But he's only going to be a one-term president. So I guess sadly, for him at least, or his family, at this point in American history, only two presidents have been one-term presidents, and that is John Adams from New England and John Quincy Adams from New England. So yeah, both of these guys, father and son, only one-term presidents. Anyway, because of some of the weird stuff that happened with the election process, and everybody being in the same party, but now everybody being sort of opposed to each other, Adams is not able to get a lot done as president. Now, as Secretary of State, we got Florida, and he wrote the Monroe Doctrine, but as president, there's not much he gets accomplished. But there is one thing, and it's pretty significant. It's called the Tariff of Abominations. Some people thought that this tariff would not pass, but it did, and he signed it. And this was basically a high tariff, all right? The tariff of 1828, the South called it the Tariff of Abominations because, again, they weren't pro-tariff, and this was a high tax on almost all imports. It says 38% tax. Some of these imported goods were even as high as 45% taxed. And so the South is very angry about this, and we'll see more about that later. But basically, Adams' presidency leads to another split in, American political identity, right? So we had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists went away. We had the era of good feelings where everybody was a Democratic Republican. But now there's obviously people that followed Jackson who are mad, and there's people who followed Adams. And so those two split, all right? And what we end up with is the National Republican Party and the Democratic Party, all right? Now, I don't want you to be confused, all right? The National Republican Party is not the Republican Party that we talk about today. It's a different party. Basically, what happened was people started calling Adams and Clay, Adams and Clay's followers, they were calling them Adams Clay Republicans, and eventually they started calling them National Republicans. Basically, they stand for two things. They support the American system, and they're against anything to do with Andrew Jackson. This party will not last very long. We will actually see what happens to that party in the next video, but it's a very short-lived party. All right, Jackson's followers start referring to themselves as Jackson Democrats, and so this is considered the birth of the Democratic Party. Okay, the party we know today as the Democratic Party, this is the beginning of it, right? So we now have Republicans and Democrats, just not the same way we think of it today, all right? The National Republicans and the Democratic Party. Basically, the Democrats at this time under Jackson, they opposed government influence over the economy, especially the National Bank. They didn't like the National Bank. We'll see more about that later. They were pro-agrarian, all right? They liked the idea of an agrarian society, which they trace back to Jefferson. So some Democrats today would say they trace their party to Thomas Jefferson, but most historians say that Jackson is the founder of the Democratic Party. But in being pro-agrarian, they are also pro-slavery. Those two institutions are intertwined politically, socially, economically, all right? That's not to ruffle anybody's feathers who might be a Democrat today. If you're part of the Democratic Party today, don't take offense to the fact that that party was pro-slavery, because we're talking, 150, 200 years ago. So But they were pro-slavery, and we'll see how that again creates division. That's really what we're trying to get to the bottom of. Where does this division come from? And a big part of it has to do with one of the two major political parties in the United States was pro-slavery. They were championing the expansion of slavery. Um, the National Republicans aren't really against slavery, but they are pro-American system, which supports industry. But we'll see what eventually happens with all that. All right, so this is, we're done with this. I hope you learned something with this. Obviously, these topics are getting divisive, and they're meant to be. That's what we're studying. We're studying division. And we'll see more of that in the next video when we talk about the next president, which is Andrew Jackson. Thank you.